Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. And as you can see on the map, we have the area near Bakhmut pull up. Obviously, fighting, very heavy fighting, continues both to the west, north, and to a lesser extent to the south of Bakhmut. But first, the NATO summit in Vilnius, Lithuania. Apparently, President Zelensky, head of Ukraine, has walked away with a somewhat sour taste in his mouth. It does not look like Ukraine is going to achieve any sort of NATO membership. Compounding that, it sounded like, from information coming out of the meetings, that there is hesitancy of admitting Ukraine even post-war. Now, I've talked about this before, that within the scope of this conflict, if the Russians are aware that NATO is going to be allowed to enter, if Ukraine is going to be allowed to enter NATO post-war, why would Russia stop the war? Now, there's some other issues as well that's having some NATO member states to ask questions, to have concerns. And there is, rightfully so, concerns about admitting Ukraine. If we were to hypothetically say, okay, there was no war between Russia and Ukraine, as a matter of fact, there was no, let's say, civil war occurring, which is a de facto non-admittance to achieve NATO membership. You cannot be, as a NATO member state, in a de facto civil war, which Ukraine was. There has to be stability. So even if we eliminate that, there is anti-democratic practices that were inherent to Ukraine for since its existence, essentially. So you have Western European nation states asking questions. Hey, are we lowering the bar for admittance? Is NATO going to take anyone and everyone who desires membership, even at the expense of the very organization? So I think that's being talked about in these meetings. I think there are individuals that are attending these meetings that are competent, that are reasonable, and they're asking the hard questions. And I don't think the Ukrainian delegation likes these questions. Now, just in terms of analyzing the anti-democratic practices that occur inside of Ukraine, the corruption, the massive amounts of corruption that exist inside of Ukraine, we have these other factors. We have internal conflict, and obviously we have a major war with the Russian Federation. So, again, the likelihood that Ukraine achieves NATO membership is incredibly low. The individuals that are pushing for immediate NATO membership, it is just so nonsensical, so asinine to even pose that question with what's happening right now, because that puts us in World War III. The minute Ukraine is allowed into NATO, especially under these conditions, and I don't know how you would do it, because the charter, the way the NATO charter reads, you simply can't do it. You cannot do it. But hey, you know what? Look at Kosovo, look at Libya. Crazier things have happened. So again, NATO membership in terms of Ukraine equals what will essentially become World War, or a very large-scale war against the Russian Federation. Does the United States need to go to war against the Russian Federation? Ask yourself that question. And what good is Ukraine? What assistance, what benefit does Ukraine give to the United States, except being a money pit, except being a conduit for the Biden administration, for Hunter Biden to siphon off millions of dollars and enrich his family? That's what occurred with Ukraine. So ask yourself that. Be reasonable. Now, what's happening in the war? Well, fighting, as I said, continues in to the west of Bakhmut. We have reports that Ukrainian forces attempted to push into this town here, the settlement rather, that is just to the northwest of Bakhmut. It's Berhivka, this area here. Apparently, a company-sized Ukrainian formation, possibly smaller, possibly bigger, we don't know at this point, attempted to push its way into Berhivka, and it was engaged by elements of the Russian 200 Motorized Rifle Brigade and elements of the 18th Russian Motorized Rifle Division. We do have reports that Ukrainian prisoners of war were taken. Some elements of that Ukrainian force did end up surrendering to Russian forces, as there was very heavy fighting that took place in and around this area here. Outside of that, and we believe that to be a probing attack, essentially a reconnaissance in force by Ukrainian forces to continue to try and engage the Russian defensives that are in this area. We do know that the Russians are bringing in additional forces. They're bringing additional reserve formations to strengthen its hold on Bakhmut and areas around Bakhmut. But again, very, very tough road for the Ukrainians if they expect to retake Bakhmut. The Russians are dug in. They have lines to the east of Bakhmut and are continuing to strengthen their position in and around Bakhmut as well. In other areas, it looks like to the south of Zaporizhia, this area here, the Ukrainians have all but given up on this area. Apparently, there is just really no viable way for the Ukrainians to crack this multiple layer of Russian defenses that are in this area. Let's convert this over here to the default map, where we can exclude roads and we can kind of see the Russian fortification system. So even if the Ukrainians are able to penetrate this first layer of defensive areas and observation posts, there are secondary areas, and then finally the main Russian, the secondary and main Russian lines of defense, and then obviously the Russian tactical and strategic reserve that is operating to the west-south of Tokmak as well. So it looks like at this point the Ukrainians are giving up on this area here, and again, it was one of the areas where they made some of the lowest headway of the conflict. If we look over in this area here, this is near Rivnopil. This area seems to be the focus in which the Ukrainians think they may have success. Now, we haven't seen it thus far. I mean, a lot of these areas are open fields, but ultimately the goal of Ukrainian forces, the goal of this great counteroffensive by the Ukrainians was ultimately the severing of the land corridor, the seizing of Tokmak, the seizing of Melitopol, and eventually driving down and threatening Mariupol. And that has not happened. No objective that the Ukrainian military had set for itself. And some of these were very big objectives. Again, Mariupol, very tough objective. Now, if the Ukrainians believed for some reason that the Russian lines and Russian morale was at a point of being incredibly low, the Ukrainians may have thought that the Russians would break and ultimately they would achieve a major breakthrough. And that hasn't happened. The Russians are fighting. The Russians are resisting. And it's not an easy road right now for the Ukrainians. The other area just south of Orikhiv, kind of the same in terms of success. Again, the measuring of area taken is incredibly small. And we look here, 3.63 kilometers. And essentially, that is what the Ukrainians have taken since the beginning of June. June 4th, I guess you would say June 4th would be the official kickoff of the Ukrainian offensive. And the Ukrainians were giving themselves in excess of 30 days to achieve a breakthrough and try and break through some of these Russian defensive lines. They haven't been able to do it. In 30 days, they've moved under 4 kilometers in the area near Orikhiv. And these areas were vital if they were looking to move down, seize control of Tokmak, seize control of Melitopol, seize control of Berdyansk and Mariupol. That was the goal. And the Ukrainians, unfortunately for the Ukrainians, have not achieved that goal. Even areas near Volhodar, where the Ukrainians alleged operational success from a defensive standpoint, we never saw the Ukrainians try to move near Volhodar as well. Or if they did, they realized very quickly that, again, they weren't going to achieve any breakthrough. And that's the way it is on that whole southern front line right now. And I'm sure as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, meets in Vilnius, they're looking at this. Because you are now looking at war in perpetuity. Does the Ukrainian state, in conjunction with NATO, continue to just try and pound away at these Russian lines in hope of some sort of success? And how many lives are the Ukrainians going to expend in these operations? We don't know. And ultimately, there are two routes to this conflict. One route is a route of possible discussion and acceptance. The other route is escalation. Because the only way forward for the Ukrainians in terms of military success is going to be with direct NATO intervention. And what I mean by direct NATO intervention, that NATO is already intervening in the conflict. I mean overt intervention. NATO boots on the ground, NATO aircraft flying over Ukraine, trying to gain air supremacy over Russian air forces. And then obviously we know that where that leads. And I'm sure there are cooler heads in these Western nation states that do not want to go that route. They do not want to see Russian cruise missiles raining down on Western cities. Cities in Poland, cities in Germany, cities in France, cities in the United Kingdom. They don't want to see unrestricted Russian submarine warfare against merchant ships, because this is where it would take us. You thought there were supply shortages in the West. Well, if we start to have actual worldwide naval warfare with nuclear attack subs, then obviously you can imagine what that's going to do to supply chains. It's not going to help the supply chain issue at all. And I think, again, the cooler heads are looking at that, are weighing those facts and asking how far can we push this war in Ukraine before we start to see the conflict spread. And then you have to look at China as well. China is a component. Obviously, China is looking at Taiwan. And at what point does China go all in with Russia? And again, we're right back in terms of global war. World War III. It's happened. It has happened in the past. It will happen again. So this is kind of where we set. We will continue to monitor the situation. We will continue to report on what is occurring both in Lithuania and obviously on the front lines in this continued war. Thank you for joining us today. More to come very, very soon. And as always, have a good day.